Hello, all, and now resuming our discussion or tracking through Simulacra and Simulation with Jean Baudrillard in 1981. We're now on to really the discussion and chapter of the implosion of meaning in media, which really starts off with three separate hypotheses for our really relationship with information and content, or at least the meaning of it. And so he starts off with the first in information producing meaning cannot make up ultimately for its own lack of signification. The second hypothesis is information has nothing to do with signification or the operational model, if you'd like. And so if it's outside, and therefore outside of meaning, but is ultimately in circulation of meaning strictly. And then third is a sort of, or at least I should say the ordering of it. I put for the second one. And then the third is really the rigorous correlation between both of those hypotheses, and that information destroys or neutralizes out meaning and signification. And so, there's no real clear, distinct answer that he gives, but it's simply just his three avenues that he really sees in this relationship of the implosion of meaning. And to perhaps put this in with Baudrillard's language, or at least the framework towards his ideas, you have the idea of the obscenity, which really stands in for this implosion of meaning as a sort of abundance. And the obscenity is more than itself and applied or accentuates, if you'd like, those properties of that cited out object towards really the conditions of the hyperreal that we went into, or Baudrillard does earlier in the text. And so I think with this insight, we could perhaps look at how through at least some of the themes and ideas on my own stuff on the channel, if I could swing that in for a second here for you guys. Really the narration, what's this creative aspect of what is considered news or the headline, what are we ultimately paying attention to? And this is a creative act, or at least for me. And in that, we could perhaps read through with Baudrillard here in how this is obscene or even an absurdity. Because, of course, taking that on with how media and its proliferation of these images and something like the concept of newsworthiness or a headline, there is a directive of an ideological conviction or a sort of worldview that is, somewhat presupposed. Even if we were supposed to supposedly, see media as, a bunch of Cronkite agents, if you'd like, this perhaps narrative of being neutral, of only accounting for states of affairs in this mode, is still ultimately a sort of absurd, or at least for me, in a sort of absurd and even obscene way to accentuate that very narrative, even if it is something that's, the narrative of being neutral. And so the obscenity of media is equal to the implosion of media, with the absurd headlines of what is given really our attention to. And of course, we could sit here and say that there's a lot of kitschy and pop culture that ultimately just takes up so much space in our lives, really, or our attention spans. And I think that reigns with what Baudrillard is saying about these obscene hyperreal images that ultimately implodes the very concept or difference between the messages and the actual medium itself. But for Baudrillard, it is important to point out that the messaging itself has a sort of historical or historicism quality and basis for a sort of human historical precedent through messages or communication that doesn't necessarily have an affinity or a necessity to be coded or overcoded, as we see with the hyperreal in the present day. And I think that's a subtle distinction that is worth actually making. Information is that obscenity, or its proliferation of the hyperreal of it, and is for the sake of only producing more information. And so this is a new phase of communication in and of itself that it's kind of put into the realm of the hyperreal. Communication for Baudrillard, though, isn't just something that should be celebrated, but is really the consequence of the hyperreal. And so information makes obscene the Socratic dialogues, if you'd like, discourses, and put it into what he calls escape velocity, where there is no end, there's no dialectical synthesis, if you'd like, no endpoint, no ends to the sort of telos of instrumentalization, if you'd like. And so there's no creation of new limits, like with the case of perhaps what Marx would say about Capital or Deleuze and Guattari, and how they say that there's differing plateaus, of course. And so when you go to the apex of a new one, this for Baudrillard is not the case anymore, at least in this new phase, because now we are accelerated into this escape velocity of really accelerating into the void. There's no end point. And so information, in a similar way, devours itself. It devours its own content in communication, in the social sphere, rather than creating the possibilities, the avenues of communication. It is actually exhausting itself in the staging of creating communications. And so if its process is really the staging of communication, or establishing a staging of meaning, then this is what makes it exhaustible. Then this is no longer the case of really using the medium to accentuate conversations or to make them more possible. It's actually now the opposite is putting itself forward for the sake of simply putting itself forward, as the same way that the escape and the velocity of accelerating toward that spatial void, if you'd like. And so this is now really onto the second example, where the mass media destruction of the social and information has dissolved meaning. And this doesn't give us into this sort of surplus of finding new innovation, but this is actually of an entropic attitude. And so information devours its communication vestiges so much that to be outside of this sort of the sphere of information, if you'd like, or the proliferation of these media messages, then you're just outside. You're kind of a social leper, if you'd like. You're unsocial. And to be a little less abstract about it, I would say when there's a sort of new social media app, if you'd like, and this has happened a couple times now in recent years, because of course you could reference perhaps TikTok. And so, you have a rise of a sort of competing social sphere, if you'd like. And if you're, outside of it, if you don't participate, then, in that regard, you're kind of outside of the loop. You may not get, all of your little nephew's references or something at, Thanksgiving dinner, if you'd like. And, for Baudrillard here, this is, him kind of pointing us that, instead of, possibilities and innovation, or even, opposing this very system, or information and its access is actually, conforming us, is coding us into a system that wants to, of course, code and capitulate or at least articulate every possibility, really, and sort of control it. And so even the spaces outside of totalizing systems, this is, of course, a classic Foucauldian and really postmodern observation here. And in suggesting so is really the example of affirming the negation. And so the outside space, of course, is still somewhat in servitude into the totalizing narrative or structure. And so you see in sort of competing, despotic, if you'd like, groups, or even, thinking, if you'd like, if you're taking what you consider a totalizing narrative that is insufficient, or it's wrong, it's not true, but, are you not offering up a different totalizing narrative, a different structure that still codes and embodies in the same practicality that the structure you opposed prior could have? Now, Baudrillard, not only himself, he offers, solutions or strategies to dealing with a system constricted as such. But, I think we could also perhaps, use a little bit of skepticism or as he would put it, turn himself on himself, or turn Baudrillard on Baudrillard, and, say that, perhaps on the individual basis, a minoritarian aspect, if you'd like, you could say, on that individual basis, you could perhaps check out of this system. You don't have to conform and, make the TikTok account and, sign up for the latest terms of service to be able to have access to goods and services, if you'd like, or payment processing systems. There are ways to, defer away from this that we'll get into, including with Baudrillard. But Baudrillard's ways to really attack the system, and he does, advocate for, the sort of embodiment, really, of those micro problems, if you'd like, where, street violence could perhaps swell up. But really, he's really for anything that sort of disturbs that very coding of trying to, again, articulate and really bring under control any sort of possibilities outside of the state apparatus. And so we turn again to what he says of the medium and the message with Marshall McLuhan. And so the medium is the message, is really the end of the message for Baudrillard, because, there's this distinction between the two, but the medium is no longer media in the median power of one reality to another. So talking about, this is sort of the hyperreal, and then this is the real, if you'd like. That's sort of binary there. And, when you're in one form of the media, you're perhaps not in the medium aspect of it, but the content or the form with the implosion that Baudrillard's talking about implies really that there's one pole that's actually devouring into the other, and so the truth of medium is the message actually dissolves in itself. It's sort of the serpent swallowing its own tail, and so even that third party, the subject, really stands in line with the masses, because even that subject is dissolved in this relationship here. It's the masses, and so in the paradox of the masses, and this is a very interesting take that I think Baudrillard has here. The media, in its neutralization, does it produce an informed or uninformed masses, or as the masses, are we actually resisting the media with the digesting of those images without necessarily responding or affirming them? So, he's kind of positing what's the difference here is, do the media neutralize and produce and create, information or a lack of information in the people, or do the masses resist it? And so the counter strategy of the masses themselves against power is really in its actual lack of response. But, are mass media on the side of power? Because, of course, the manipulation of the masses, or being on the side of the masses, could, go hand in hand with that liquefying of meaning. And if we dissipate meaning, and this is now where you bring in what he has to say in Forgetting Foucault, we don't have a such thing as power. Power is circulatory, or the capillary powers, if you'd like, through these different mechanisms of meaning, because of course you have to have frameworks. And when you look at the sexual discourse and the history of sexuality with Foucault, you have the rise of the medical institution, which relies on a sort of discourse to extend or to assemble an attachment with that said sexual discourse to ultimately create a sort of medical field or jargon of these different causal relationships or phenomenon that must be diagnosed or put through this institution. And of course that requires meaning. Those terms and really the field, if you'd like, has a sort of meaning, a framework to it. But if we're claiming that there's a dissipation of meaning, and certainly in mass conceptive aspects of it, or to make nothing of it, then we see that power actually will disappear. And so Baudrillard proposes that these entities of power are, not just a given, if you'd like, not just something that we just are born into, and we see this institution and we say, well, that institution or that thing is sort of almost a culmination, if you'd like, of all of history prior, which of course is very popular in the way we look at history, or have looked at history in the last century or so. And seeing these institutions as almost a sort of culmination of really everything, of all of human history, if you'd like. These are actually, very arbitrary for Baudrillard, and for, many of the postmodernists, I would say, that these frameworks aren't necessarily, or meaning of them, such as with, classical Marxism and production and the modes of which he speaks of power there, that for Baudrillard is ultimately dissipated away as well. And so if meaning is distributed to a sort of mass democratic state, then what does it really truly mean? If all walks of life are able to tap into these messages, if you'd like, these mechanisms to find meaning, and there's a sort of equilateral access to it, then what does that really mean? And how does that really change the meaning of it? And really, we could say that the strategy is to oppose the extension of those ideas. And so if we turn to Paris and the relationship to France as a sort of nation state, France becomes the culture of Paris. Now, of course, when you had these city-states, those more classical, if you'd like, ways of those large European city-states, they proliferated a sort of culture within them, within the city-state, if you'd like. And ultimately, though, this decentralized, if you'd like, out into the very nation-states that they were a part of. But this wasn't just because of trade and transportation, but it's actually the communicative aspect. It's the proliferation of those cultural messages or statistical aggregates that really become the norms in our social that proliferates Paris culture onto the rest of France. And now we really want to hone in on one of his main ideas within this text, which is of course related to advertisement. Advertisement leads to the falling of this distinction between consumers or producers. As the medium becomes its own message, or for the sake of itself, regurgitative, if you'd like, advertisement is in tandem to the social simply by the demands placed for the social to behave as a sort of business model, a sort of transaction. And you see this a lot now, I think, in a lot of today's discourse. Certainly if we want to go back to perhaps how the popularity of self-help and its proliferation of content, then you're really seeing not just advertisements, of course, but there's a sort of transactional really attitude, and especially maybe this is true of the American content creators exceptionally, where a lot of these relationships, they very much look at it as a sort of business transaction. And many of the people in those actual spheres are of course businessmen. They're trying to sell self-help programs, and in this social, we task onto it to give us this business model, this sort of once consumer and productive relationship onto the social now. And so advertising is much more than just the consumption of an object, but is the service of consuming the actual advertising. And so in the cultural necessity of it, this sort of endless proliferation or consumption, this relates really to that subject, that third party member who's watching on the media and the messages dissolve into or proliferate into one another. This also could be applied to the subject no longer having the sort of autonomy of recognizing what they actually truly desire. There's so many ways in which advertising could perhaps work as a sort of avenue far beyond just being a sort of passive consumer who just exhibits what they actually desire. There's very many different methodologies and even negative tactics, I would say, to try to deter you from the consumption of one object for the consumption of another. And so that necessarily isn't just a passive consumer demonstrating desire onto the social, but it's far more complex than that. It is not just the passive consumer, though, who loses identity, but the active agent in the world. So he really enters into what's the difference between political and the economy, because they have ultimately folded into another in the proliferation of mass media. So the political actor actually becomes a sort of consumer of the very system it's looking to oppose, and actually embodies the formalized logic despite their plead for a sort of opposition to it. And I think this is a very powerful observation that really shares, what we, especially in this sort of dissident scene, if you'd like, need to really think about here, because, a lot of the ways we, look to exhibit our opposition are very much simply consumptive. They are, ones of simply, exhibiting that we're supposedly political activists, but yet we demonstrate it through the consumption of that very system. And, to be a little less opaque, if you'd like, think about the ways in which you think of new political ideas, or, the philosophy of this very video, if you'd like. You're consuming my content, just like I used to and still do, go around and consume other people's content, or, texts, if you'd like. And, are we not just all embodying that kind of logic to it? And you can also notice there that, I'm not necessarily just a consumer, I'm also producing, and through advertisement, or at least this concept here, that difference, is no longer one that's applicable, if you'd like. And so, since we won't be able to discern the difference of categories of politics and economics, and again, you see that with, a lot of people's appeals to, especially on the GOP side of nominees, is, let's grow the GDP, which is a very abstract, productive value of the nation state. And, to some degree, of course, there is marks of economic activity that, shows a sort of healthy system. But in that discourse, though, we're demonstrating that, the economics of it and the politics have, became one in that system. There's, no way of just going about politics without involving economics, and there's no way of going about economics without involving politics, of course. And so we must concern ourselves with the opposition to a system does not actually, and this is what Baudrillard is really trying to get at, I think, with, a lot of people will say Baudrillard just actually ends up in a strange way affirming the system simply because he rejects all of these ways that opposition comes about. But Baudrillard is simply just critiquing how many times we end up reproducing that very logic that we oppose to begin with. And so resistor groups can try to perhaps consider what Baudrillard is saying in the, just his philosophy by and large, to perhaps, enrich themselves and actually, maybe see this process in a different way than they did before. Now, Baudrillard introduces a very interesting idea regarding doublings, or the double. The double is, of course, for, in the sort of medical apparatus, is the oldest prosthesis of the body, which is an imaginary figure, just as the soul or the shadow image haunts that very subject like his other. And there's another text where Baudrillard famously talks about the story of the student in Prague who sold his image to the devil, but the student, in doing so, has given up his freedom, if you'd like. He's now at the beckon of this doubling, who determines now, who beats him in every aspect of actually being able to exert onto his life, his sort of freedom of determinacy, if you'd like, that's already determined by this double. And so the double ruins the student's life to the point where the student has to kill his doubling. But of course, in doing so, as he kills the double, he has also killed himself. Baudrillard, in using this story as a sort of metaphor, the double for Baudrillard simultaneously is putting in itself, but also is never the same again, which is a subtle but always averted death. So again, you're kind of almost always in that sort of Deleuzian way of becoming in relation to being. You can't really, catch it, just like running your hand through the Heraclitean water, if you'd like. You're never going to be able to grasp it fully, if you'd like, because we're always in that sort of way of becoming, which I think Baudrillard is very interested in. I think that's really the key, and I know it's a very abstract way, but there's no other way of really describing it, because once it kind of takes on that simulative process, then you're then you're kind of like inside of it now, and this is really about being on the outside. And so really he's demonstrating to us that the secret or the challenge is, of course, the spirit of man, and how he is always becoming. He is always in a sort of a state of adverting whatever adjective, whatever description, whatever all-encompassing truth value system where we think we have it all figured out. Of course, the human spirit in that sort of way comes back around seductively, if you'd like, and adverts it. And Baudrillard, though, is really concerned with how the doubling can go to the age of the clone, where the clone is a sort of human cutting and really a becoming of that matrix. And so you have a sort of identical individual born out of the cuttings, or the sort of fungible adjectives, really, of what a being is. And so you arrive to the point of cloning is actually a sort of death, just as with the student in Prague. And so the cloning is a perpetual cuttings of that doubling, and puts us now in that state of perpetual death. We're always in a state of dying because of that clone. And so just as how the double died, so did the student. This is the end, or at least by overcoming the state of affairs of this biological determined basis, genetics, if you'd like. Certainly you would think of contemporary discussions with biological sex. And so in doing so, by cloning, you're actually overcoming the sort of bodily states of affairs that you've been put in. And in doing that, in liberating ourselves from that, we are actually grounding or losing that ground of what our humanity or a relationship with the milieus, with the territory, was actually like. And so in that sense, we live in a time where we're yearning really to use those cuttings, that act of cutting being, and supplanting it or sort of supplement into that framework of what was the human body, if you'd like. And so in doing so, the hyperreal body phase is really the dissection, the body into fragmented organs. And so by doing so, by creating an apparatus, we're rendering to a sort of analysis of scientific functionality, or a higher level of abstraction to understand the human body. And I think this has a very rich tradition in the Faustian West, where, uncovering truth, Foucault, of course, calls it, the archaeology. And he even points that out too, that, there's always this aspect of, in the medical apparatus, you're cutting down the body to find truth. And Foucault, similarly uses those kind of metaphors or analogies really in, his archaeology of his project. And I think that really sticks with how, the West really is always trying to uncover, always trying to excavate, if you'd like, the truth, or an understanding that I think is really interesting here. You're cutting the body to find the depths of, what is the true body. And, in doing so, of course, we're actually bringing the body into the coding, into fashion, or that idea of the hyperreal domain. And so making the body intelligible lends itself to actually the end of the body. And so by submerging it into its discoursing of medical activity or jargon is to bring in, this sort of understanding of the body in a way that Baudrillard is concerned about, because, there was, a body before, the medical episteme of the framework that, of course, demonstrates power onto it. And so making the body, enter this bioanatomical physical location that takes away, the bodily illusion, for ultimately an operativity of the body, and referring to the human that used to always change and resist classification. That's what Baudrillard, I think he really cares about, how, the body used to be mysterious, and, it used to be passed down from what we would consider as the divine, if you'd like, but it is not a steady figure, but is really trying to signify the spirit, the soul of what is our, if you'd like, Deleuzian becoming. And so he, is weary of, this sort of understanding, this medical framework that's, going to classify and code everything, even our own human expression. And then he interestingly turns to the idea of cancer. And so cancer is not just an illness of, what we would consider the capitalist time, but this controls all contemporary pathologies, because it is the form of the code of a redundancy of the same signals or the same cells. Cancer works, of course, in the proliferation of negative cells and mirrors the logic of the system. So, he's making a sort of comparison here to how cancer, is a metaphor for how nothing lies outside our system, for disease affects certain populations outside the domain of the sterile system. You might think of the plateau of the face, if you'd like, of that coding of, what is the friendly face to the system or the population, and things like cancer or diseases really in its movements are disproportions on how they affect, which is how the strategy of difference being flattened for that very servitude of the system. And then we turn to what Baudrillard has to say of the book by J.G. Ballard of Crash. And of course, there's a famous movie as well. And so essentially, without spending too much time on it, if you want to understand Crash, it's largely a sort of demand of people who want to be exhilarated by demonstrating crashing and the reenactments of accidents or high profile cases of, really death. And this, of course, is exciting and gives people this sort of arousal or stimulant. And this, of course, lends itself to the interpretation of technology as an extension of bodies, and in its extensive makes the bodily sophistication a part of the investment of nature. To put that into perspective, we, active technology as the mortal deconstruction of the body, the dismemberment, not a loss of unity of a subject like the psychoanalysis would say, but it is one of confusion of, and when he talks of the violent activity or the notion of sexuality, if you'd like, with the body without organs, as an extension of the logic of how the car has the narrative of escaping limitations of territory by using the car. You'll notice in those sorts of advertisements for car commercials, there's always this narrative of escaping away from your day-to-day life, if you'd like, and just go on a sort of adventure in your new Tahoe. In a similar way, he's pointing that out here in his reading of Crash. Sexuality is played similar to Crash, where the logic of the code of seeing no limits or grounding of everything, whether it's sexuality and technology. But the hyperreal, which abolishes fiction or non-fiction, is ultimately a mutation of world of simulation and death without desire or violent bodies, creating the chromatic world of coldness. And so Baudrillard wants to question whether we are entering a new phase. And again, this goes to show why I have such reverence for Baudrillard, because he's even willing to question himself, right? He actually, posits whether or not we're actually entering just simply a new phase of humanity or culture, and, we're just treading on the side of simply critique. But, how do we actually oppose a system that limits possibilities but can never fully exert in its demands? He wants to turn to a broader discussion of science fiction, because science fiction for Baudrillard kind of embodies the order of the simulacrum. And just to briefly kind of reiterate that, you have the first, which is the counterfeit or automaton, the second, which relies on the idea of production, and the third, which is the code. And science fiction is really based or nostalgic for the real in the second order, which is of production, or the libidinal or unconscious drivers are. And so we have that nostalgia for the second order of the real, because for Baudrillard, the real, at least the way we think about it, or nostalgic for that second order, if you'd like, that we're always seem to be enamored with when it comes especially to ideas of production with Marx and their influence. That kind of yearning for the second order it is demonstrated in science fiction because of this idea of resurrection of the prior social order to reconstruct that prior world, or the ideologies of the past emptied of their meaning with the retrospective of truth. Science fiction doesn't predict the future, but actually invokes a nostalgia of that second order. And this lends to how certain institutions only rise when, claimed on a sort of enlightenment basis for the human, such as the social science or psychology. So now he turns really to how, the Enlightenment kind of formed our categories or disciplines. The humanities or psychoanalysis wouldn't be if man was reducible to his rational basis, and the exploitation of really that logic of the Enlightenment as a reasonable being. And then he posits about how we think and feel towards or treat animals. And so animals are reduced to the other between the rational human agent, and then he really turns to how we would consider racism as a sort of historical concept. Racism as a sort of category only existed after slavery because historically, of course, the human encounter, before the Enlightenment, if you'd like, with other humans, such as on this channel, we've talked a bit about Cortez and the Spanish. When the Spanish arrive, it was mainly thought of that divine intervention had actually taken place, and the Spanish were the people of God, brought over, or I would suggest it could even go the other way, and you could say that they were the embodiment of the devil. Either way, there was a sort of mystery or quality to this other people that predates the biological differences and medical jargon that we see in racial differences as a sort of concept today. So before these categories of human rationality or the functions of it, these categories, if you'd like, could a racism as that sort of concept actually be the basis for its existence? And I think if you think about it for a second, racism enters into a totalizing systemic logic that could only come after slavery, because our relationship morphs into its different effects. And so in its relationship to the code to quantify or locate that desire of the state, of course, and decides how certain categories either fit or don't fit into that category. And so in that sense, we're living in a sort of natural zoning of the creation of another world, the creation of a sort of phenomenal world, if you'd like, where animals are bent off entering into our zone, our human plane, if you'd like, of creation, or deterritorialization, if you'd like. And into this zone, we humans, of course, that we created, would rather, adopt the animal and bring it out of its kingdom and into our phenomenally based perception or, relationship to the territory that is no longer the same. And so our sentiment is of a lack of respect or even disdain for the other animal, the othering, if you'd like. And so, we act as if we know what is best for the animals because, of course, it's better, or at least to us, to, bring them into our own creation rather than leaving them outside of it. And so he really turns to somewhat of a critique of Deleuze, or at least he kind of flips him here, because, of course, there is the becoming animal chapter plateau where, the animal is the ultimate territorial being. And so to take the deterritorialization of the animal when the animal is ultimately of the territory. And so for Baudrillard, the territory, resists change and is actually the crux, as opposed, or really the crux of what that animal is, internally. It's a sort of resistance to becoming. And so this, of course, is in stark opposition of what Deleuze has to say about becoming animal. And so in that same vogue, we could say that animals don't have an unconscious because they actually have a territory. And, man and psychoanalysis and, seeing it as a sort of discipline of truth, it's put in the unconscious because we've actually lost the territory, because we've zoned nature as such. And so only when we lose territory or singularity, we actually create the unconscious, attaching to a sort of grounding of creating a realness, as opposed to, historically what the milieus of a territory exhibit onto us to make us real, if you'd like. Now it's in these sort of disciplines of libidinal structures, of desire, of the unconscious. And then I think he has some very interesting takes with regards to the democratic spectacle, or his day's leftism, if you'd like, or even today, where, we're kind of seeing a sort of, again, that sort of yearning for a locus of this confrontational, oppressive power. This, the leftists actually, in that sort of sense, almost becomes, they really, actually want a formalized power. They sort of want these micro-fascisms to actually be embodied to some extent, because, they're constantly, and if you're an outsider to the left, of course, you'll always notice that they're always yearning for this sort of confrontational energy against, the other, whether it's, racists, whether it's populists, whether it's nationalists. And so, it's actually exhausting its very energies in trying to rejuvenate the other, or a sort of counter narrative. And, this is a classic real critique that you see, especially today, where, if you talk to a lot of leftists and, you posit to them, and I used to do this, of course, with a lot of my leftist friends as well, what is actually graceful for you? And, what I actually mean in that sort of sense is, what do you actually affirm? What do you truly believe, or believe as sort of virtues of what we should actually be? What should we actually do in that sort of sense? What is the good? And many times they don't actually have an answer. Or the answer will somehow come about in a sort of negation of the micro-fascist, of, turning away from the chuds, if you'd like. And so, countering that is really to them the ends in and of itself. But Baudrillard, of course, is, suggesting that, they artificially have to actually do this to give themselves a sort of meaning or purpose, if you'd like. And I think that's very interesting, and is a very damning critique, I would actually say. I agree with him a lot on that. But I want to end this video and really this discussion on Simulacra and Simulation with one of his strategies that he sees as a sort of potential, or a possibility to antidote against this, totalizing coding, if you'd like, and really unabashedly claims to be a nihilist. And so he essentially says that I accept the immense process of the destruction of appearances. And so Baudrillard, on the strategy of indifference, then, is essentially saying that those who strike with meaning are ultimately going to be killed by meaning. And so in the use of nihilism or indifference, we can supplant using the interior logic as we oppose that system. Again, he's always concerned with, embodying, again, that sort of formalized logic. Even though you think you're getting away from it, you're actually not. He's saying here that, only with indifference do you actually reject that interior logic. And so as we oppose the system to only co-opt into that system of, formal patterns or logos, and so, by trying to apply your own meaning, by trying to step into it, you are ultimately formalizing yourself and turning yourself really into a sort of cog, if you'd like. And by averting that, we could turn to what he has to say of theoretical violence. Theoretical violence for Baudrillard is, better than the truth, and should be really our answer, because Baudrillard, he has a very unique way of considering theory. Most people think of theory as either, the discussion of problems or even the prognostics and the administration of solutions onto those problems, like a philosopher king, if you'd like. Baudrillard says no, he's of course not interested in that sort of masculine, Apollonian way of trying to discern an absolute truth, or give it the sort of mandate, if you'd like. Baudrillard wants to say, theory should make us more unintelligible, actually, and to be a more feminine, philosophically bound into mystery, into seduction. And so to deter the Apollonian formalization of a masculine explanation for, everything in the world, and, how this applies to the coding to ultimately quantify everything. But of course, Baudrillard, in his own style, says that, even this theoretical violence falls to the wayside because, it's a sort of an illusion, a utopia, if you like, a complot, as they say in the French language. And so it would be beautiful to be just a straight nihilist if it was actually still radical. So again, he points to how even someone like a terrorist who, you couldn't be more radically against the system, but, what is his meaning? And this is harking back to symbolic exchange in death. What is the meaning of his death if it's already been eradicated from its, radical presentation? And so to end, he points to, of course, the leading of how you can end up with seduction, because seduction is before and after all of these processes. It is the very light of the sun being brought down onto the earth. And, whatever the coding can do, and you could say perhaps that it, cannot actually achieve, the goal of coding everything. And I would agree with that. I don't think the system can, code everything, of course, because, there's always mystery, there's always seduction, somewhere looming that prefaces the very coding that is after the coding in such an exterior way that it becomes its own beginning again, and then, goes away with all the reifications that we mustered up theoretically. But that's the bow, really, to Simulacra and Simulation. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and consider commenting, subscribing, and following the channel for more videos. I think I want to perhaps discuss what Baudrillard has to say about war, because, of course, war is very poignant, to the world right now. So I think I want to look at some of his interesting observations about war and the Gulf War. And so I hope you guys join me for that one, and I'll see you for the next one.